Hi, I'm Malika Bilal. Today, a historic peace deal between the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, is at risk of failing as mistrust grows. We ask, can the deal hold? Tweet me your thoughts or comment in our live YouTube chat.
Hello, I'm Amalia Date-Durbino. I am a professor, and you are in the stream.
This is the definitive one, that said Colombia's president after signing a final peace deal with the leftist armed movement, FARC. The landmark accord was welcomed across the world and brought Juan Manuel Santos a Nobel Peace Prize. But now the agreement is on uncertain ground, with the political opposition in the ascendancy and FARC angry at the recent high-profile arrest of a senior leader. Al Jazeera's ALESSANDRO has more from Bogota.
A year and a half ago, the historic peace deal between the Colombian government and FARC fighters was signed in this theater in downtown Bogota. Much has been achieved since. The great majority of fighters demobilized and the organization became a legal political party. The government also granted the majority of former fighters amnesty. Yet the joyful crowds are gone, and the road towards a lasting peace has become rockier as the implementation of reforms promised by the accord has started to lag. On April 9th, the arrest and extradition request to the U.S. of Jesus Santrich, a former senior FARC commander and peace negotiator on drug trafficking charges, fueled lingering suspicions about the ex-rebels' commitment to peace. While an increase in violence in areas once under the FARC's influence, as criminal gangs and remaining armed groups fight for control of the lucrative drug trade, has many wondering about the government's ability to take control of these restive regions. Add to the mix the uncertainty over presidential elections in just 5 weeks' time, dominated by the most polarizing candidates, and it's clear that the stakes are higher than ever to definitely put to rest 5 decades of civil conflict in the country.
And to discuss this further, we have Alessandro live from Bogota. Also joining us is Paloma Valencia. She's a senator with the Democratic Center Party, which recently won extra seats in legislative elections. The party has expressed concerns about the terms of the peace deal. Christian VISNES is country director in Colombia with the Norwegian Refugee Council. The organization has provided assistance to former FARC combatants within special zones aimed at reintegrating them into society. And also joining us from the Colombian capital is Andres Fernandez. He's a former advisor to the General Director of the Colombian Reintegration Agency. Well, welcome to the stream, everyone. Alessandro, I want to start with you because, of course, one of the biggest news lines currently is the one that you talked about in your piece at the beginning of this show, the arrest of Jesus Santrich. What is it about this arrest in particular that has people wondering whether or not this could disrupt the peace deal?
Well, Malika, here you have one of the FARC top commanders, one of the big negotiators in Havana, Cuba, who signed the deal together with the Colombian government, who is now being arrested on charges of allegedly trafficking with Mexican drug traffickers to send up to 10 tons of cocaine to the U.S. And according to the indictment that came from the New York Southern District Court, he would have done this after the signing of the deal in a conspiracy that had been going on since June of last year. Now, so since a lot of Colombians were worried about the fact that the FARC could continue operating and being part of drug trafficking in the region, this of course came as a shock, and it was a big shock to a lot of people in the country who also support the deal. On the other side, though, this is also the first opportunity to see how this accord works in the case of one of these former FARC members participating in criminal activities.
I want to share with our audience what former FARC members are saying about this arrest. This is a tweet from Ivan MARQUEZ, who you'll hear from in just a second, but he tweets in Spanish referencing the Interior Minister of Colombia, saying, "I can tell you that justice is obeyed, yes, but the injustice is not. This is consecrated by universal law, and that is why we are asking you to undo the Judicial Assembly against Santrich and proceed towards his release." Now, he's also spoken about this. Have a listen to some of the angry reaction by FARC leaders and Ivan in particular.
Con la captura de nuestro camarada Jesus Santrich.
With the capture of our comrade Jesus Santrich, the peace process is at its most critical phase and threatens to be a real failure. To the mentioned breaches from the state, a new situation is now added that we had already considered since Congress, and on account of the perverse action of the Attorney General, the dismantling of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace has now begun.
Se iniciara el desmonte de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz.
Paloma, I'm wondering what you think about this, because I know that the last time you appeared on our show in 2016, you were against this peace deal. This could indicate that the government is serious about making sure that infractions are not met with impunity, that they are punished.
Well, actually, I would say that the agreement grants the FARC absolute impunity. They are now elected as senators and congressmen in our Congress, even though they didn't pay even 1 day of jail by the crimes they committed. They didn't recognize the crimes. They are now into office. They will be into office, and they didn't even ask for forgiveness of the victims. We saw how they took all the money into the politics. The government allowed them to keep the money, even though they were supposed to give it and announce everything. The general attorney showed they were keeping a lot of money in businesses which were intervened by the general attorney. And now there's news that Santrich was in businesses with El Cartel de Sinaloa. I had the information from the beginning that FARC, when they began with the negotiation with the government, were bringing a lot of people of Mexico who claim to be from the Cartel de Sinaloa, especially to the south of the country, and they were selling the crops, the illicit crops, to these people, and they were linking them to the peasants who have the cultivations all over, for example, Cauca and Nariño. Everybody was telling this story, but what I fear is that they didn't actually get out of the business, but they kept the business and wanted to go on with it. I think that's inadmissible, not only for the Colombian people, but for the government, which has been giving them everything, and even though they were not complying with the basic things they promised to do, as getting out of the...
Paloma, as you're talking, I can see Andres. Andres, I can see you kind of itching to get in there. Go ahead. What's your take?
No, on the contrary, I believe that the investigation that is carrying out to Santrich precisely shows that the institutions are working and that there is no general impunity. It shows that the rule of law is working, and of course he deserves a due process, but if he's found guilty, he should be sentenced and prosecuted. But it shows that actually the agreement is strong, institutions are strong, and it starts to debunk all the myths that were surrounding the agreement. For example, that the state was going to be controlled by FARC. It was shown they only had 50,000 votes, more or less. So for sure they are not taking the state through elections. And on the other hand, if they break the law, they're being sanctioned. So I think both of the most important myths that surrounded the agreement are debunked with the actions of the government and of the general attorney, which I must say is doing a great job.
I want to
But
share.
Andres, the government hasn't done anything. This is the action
No,
of the general attorney, which is not
No,
part
it's
of the
not
government.
only the action of the
Actually,
general
we're
attorney.
waiting to
The
see if the
general
government
attorney
does
has
something.
collaborated with the government, and precisely all of these measures have been taken because the government is collaborating with the general attorney, as it has had throughout his appointment. And so I think both the general attorney and the government are showing that the agreement is strong and that the institutions are not taken by FARC.
So I see where you disagree there, Paloma and Andres, but I want to bring in our community right here. This is Kampa on Twitter, who says, if you look at the history of Colombia and the many peace deals signed with guerrillas, it is not the guerrillas who break them, it is the government. A better question would be, is the government actually committed to peace? So there is some skepticism from people online, but I wanted to share a comment from someone on the other side of that spectrum, someone who says, this peace deal is a good thing, but there are some things we need to keep in mind. This is Even Briscoe on the reintegration of former FARC rebels.
So far, the peace process with the FARC has scored some really important achievements, basically demobilizing and disarming 7,000 former combatants, creating a new political party out of what was a guerrilla movement for over half a century. And when you look at the state of the peace process and consider that there are elections coming up, there are worries as to what will happen with the fundamental parts of the longer term process of bringing the FARC ex-combatants back into civilian life with reincorporation, with the productive projects, economic projects which they can get involved in, with the coca substitution program. So there's a lot to be worried about, and many people are just waiting to see what exactly the new government will do and whether it will move ahead with these vital parts of the peace process.
So Christian, he mentioned their reincorporation, what others are calling these reintegration zones. Tell us about them. What was the purpose, and are they living up to that purpose?
Well, the purpose of the reintegration zones were actually to start the process of creating peace in the territories where the conflict has affected most. All these zones have been located around the country where you would have found the FARC most active, but also where you've had the most victims. Many of these areas around Colombia is where you have had 7 million people being displaced the last 30 years, and where you have had almost no presence by the Colombian state. And this is where we have been supporting the implementation of the peace agreement, where we had to have, together with the Colombian government, with the Ministry of Education, been providing education not only for the people that are going to reintegrate, those that handed in the weapons, but also the communities living in around those areas. Because that is important to take into account that, for example, in terms of education, almost none of the ex-combatants had finished their primary or secondary education, and lived more or less in that sense in the same situation as the general community. We have worked more than 20 years with education in the midst of the conflict, with victims of the conflict, and what we have seen is that those people in those areas never finished their education. So this has been one of the first and sadly one of the few really important, I think, measures that have been starting to implement. I saw one of the project sites just a few weeks ago, when we saw really the big potential that this has, where we saw a small community where there were only one family left last year, and now there's returned 30 families because education has started again, and they're living very close to one of these camps. This is just a small example of the real potential. However, this is not happening on a large scale. We had much bigger hope that the Colombian government, with the support of the international community, would scale up those types of activities.
Malika, if I may complement the results that Christian is just mentioning, we have to take into account that we are in a new context. It's not the government unilaterally working alone as it was before. We have a National Reincorporation Council in which every decision is taken jointly with FARC. In only 8 months, this process began once the laying down of arms concluded. That was August last year. We have more than 12,000 people which are already included in the financial system. Of those 12,000, the vast majority are receiving the one-off allowance of 2 million pesos to help them adapt to the civilian society. They are receiving the 90% of the Colombian minimum wage to make sure that they adapt to the early stages of civilian life. There are almost 9,000 of them in the Social Security. The government is covering Social Security. 5,000 of them are receiving education support, as Christian was saying, with the Norwegian Council for Refugees. 11,000 of them are in the health system. 4,000 of them are receiving vocational training. 5,500 of them are receiving training for cooperatives, certified training. Almost 700 of them are being technified as agricultural technicians.
So Andres,
only in these 8 months, no other peace agreement in the world has these results after 8 months.
Okay, all right. So I hear the premise here. I hear Andres' premise. He just laid out all of the successes in his view. Alessandro, I know that you have also visited the camps. And Paloma, I hear that you want to get in as well. Alessandro, you go ahead first.
Just very short. I think that the issue in many of these camps is that the government hasn't managed to create a climate of confidence on part of many of these former rebels. And we don't know how many of them have actually left the camps, for example. This is something that we've been trying to understand, get a number from the government. And we don't know until now how many of them have left. All we know, just Andres, one moment, please. We know that they left in droves. This is something that, I mean, just going to many camps. Some camps have been way more successful than others. This is the point. Now, this is a mammoth task, and I have to say I agree with Andres that the government is doing a lot. But my question, I guess, is if he also thinks that the government has been slow in starting this process, and that this has created a climate where many of them have decided instead to leave.
2 points there to complement your worries.
Andres, sum it up in one point, because I know Paloma wants to get it as well.
Okay, one point.
No, the
incorporation is not tied to a specific point in the Colombian geography. They are allowed and they have the right to move all around the country, and that's why the reincorporation agency is making sure through specialized psychologists that they are receiving the support, and that's why we have the results that I've just mentioned. It's a myth that the reincorporation should only take place in the zones. For the ones who want to stay there, yes, but for the ones that have the right to go out, they also receive the support. And the other thing is that the zones have a transitory time period. I think the zones have been useful for this first 2.5 years for the disarmament and for early reincorporation. But in the long term, we should start thinking about how are we going to close them responsibly.
Paloma?
Is it true or not that this is one of the concerns that the UN has? Sorry, Paloma.
Of course, there's a lot of concerns, but these processes are not easy and they have a lot of challenges. But I repeat, if we compare these results to any other peace agreement in the world, I'm sure that these results are the better ones after only 8 months of starting reincorporation.
So I hear where Andres is coming from. Paloma has been waiting very patiently. Paloma, go ahead.
No, I think the complete process is a failure. It's not about how many people do you demobilize. It's not about how many people you take into the justice, that at this point is none. The point is that Colombia is now facing a very serious problem with all other people from FARC and from other groups who are trying to get the same that as FARC did. All these groups who are devoted to drug trafficking want the same deal FARC obtained. So they're trying to push the government into new negotiations. We're talking about the LAN. We're talking about all other criminal bands who has illicit crops all over the country, because the government, with the excuse of the Havana process, just neglected the combat of the illegal crops in the country. And now Colombia is again the first producer of cocaine all over the country, all over the world. And we're facing a very serious problem, because now Colombians are very sure that Colombian peace was not a political issue. It's about the illicit crops and the illegal activities that all these armies have.
if I may, 3,000 lives
Sorry, Andres,
saved
I want
per
to
year.
finish this because we have heard you a lot saying this is a success, and it hasn't been, because in the places in which the government is trying to eradicate the illicit cultivation, the homicide rate has increased in more than 7%, and you have places with an increase in 22%, and you see a general increase in the homicide all over the country, and this is worrying the people. We have situations.
So Paloma, I hear your concerns. I hear Andres saying that those stats aren't true. I want to jump in here because I want to bring in our community, though I will say I heard the stats from Paloma. I heard Andres say that those stats were not exactly true. And of course, Al Jazeera cannot independently confirm or deny that. But I want to bring in Omar here on Twitter.
He
says,
this is information from the government.
Okay, well, Omar here is actually worried about
Paloma,
some of those victims that you might be talking about.
The lowest homicide rate in the last 42 years.
It has gone down. I want to bring in Omar here on Twitter. Omar says the FARC political party has three challenges. Paloma and Andres, give a little space for our community who's watching live and they want to inject their voice in here as well. Omar says the FARC political party has three challenges. Change this image as villains that Colombia's urban population have about them, deal with the assassinations and persecution of their militants, he says, and make a great effort to get the full compliance of the peace accord by the Colombian state. Christian, I know that you work with victims. Do you think that these three challenges this person raises here on Twitter are something that victims are looking for, or whether they're possible at all?
Well, it's a huge challenge, and I think some of those do mean many things for victims. I think many talked about this process. This was a negotiation process that lasted for more than 4 years in its public phase, and many talked about the importance of early response and to create trust. And we must say that there has been too little and too few actions, though. As highlighted, things have been responded to. What is very important now is to build on the things that we see is working. If you go to the areas of Colombia that's been affected by the conflict and ask the people are not against the peace agreement. They are in favor of a peace agreement. They want peace, but they are extremely frustrated by the lack of progress. And really what should be done, and what we hope also the coming government will do, is to look at what has worked. And there are things that have been working, and I think that is what needed to be scaled up. We are very concerned about new displacement, new conflict. However, I think the only way we can change this is really responding to the underlying factors. And those are, at the end of the day, the frustration and the lack of opportunities for people in those areas most affected by the conflict. There you have to start with easy things. Education is one thing. 1 in 10 of youth living in the most affected areas of Colombia don't finish school. That is an easy action and an easy win if you get started.
Alessandro, I can see you nodding your head.
Yeah, Malika, I mean, I think that one important factor to consider here is the way we talk about peace in general and this peace deal in Colombia, and it has a lot to do with the horrible political polarization in the country. So while I think the government should be criticized for the slowness in delivering some of the promises they made to the FARC and the population in these rural areas, on the other side, the truth is that most of the criticism is coming from people like Paloma Valencia and our party, the Centro Democrático, who have decided to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's essentially what they're doing, and it's never a constructive conversation. And we're just a few months away from presidential elections here. And I think that it's very difficult if the conversation remains as that this has been a complete failure. It's difficult to build on top of that. And that's what also I think half of the country worries about, especially if the party of Paloma Valencia gets into power here, that they'll just try to tear into pieces this accord and lose an opportunity for change in many parts of this country that require that change, starting with land titling, real rural reform, which has been at the root of the conflict since the 1960s. Property of the land in Colombia is the
Right.
most unequal in the
Alessandro
world.
RAMPIETTI. Alessandro, I am going to pause you there because that is something we will come back and check on when it is time for elections, because there's so much more to discuss. I want to thank all of our guests for joining us today, and of course to our community. Keep the conversation going on Twitter, YouTube, and Al Jazeera.